and schools. The next panel at the Council of Conservative Citizens National Conference was a discussion of independent political parties and their effect on elections. This part of the conference is an hour 45 minutes.
Well, as I was saying, welcome back from lunch. I'm going to be the moderator of the panel that's going to be discussing multiculturalism and the future of America. Unavoidably, this laps over into questions like immigration, and I'm sure that we will replow a lot of ground that has been plowed before. And I will go first and then introduce the other speakers who will speak in the order that appears in your program. Multiculturalism and the future of America. Well, to those of us who are conservatives and who believe that America should be and must be a white European country, multiculturalism and the future of America is sort of like a question like AIDS and life expectancy. The two are on a collision course. And I thought in starting the panel off that I would speak in terms of lies and truths. Rarely does a speaker start his presentation with a lie, but I'm going to start my talk with one of the greatest lies. That lie is the mantra that we hear over and over again, that we are a nation of immigrants, that America is a nation of immigrants. All of you have heard that over and over, that we are a nation of immigrants. I'd like to have a hand here, and don't feel bashful. We're not opposed to you if you are an immigrant. But how many of you are immigrants? I see about 5 hands. How many of you are native born? Those of you who are native born, do you believe you're an immigrant? The term immigrant does not refer to someone whose ancestors came to this country. My ancestors, some of them came in. I have some recent immigration. I have one ancestor who came to America after the Revolution, who was a German who came into South Carolina in the 1840s. With the exception of him, all of my ancestors were here well before the Revolution. And ancestors of mine fought at Bunker Hill with the Massachusetts militia. That won't go well with some of you Southerners. But also ancestors of mine fought at Kings Mountain at the end of the Revolution, when the Revolution was won in the South. None of my ancestors were immigrants when they fought at those battles. In fact, some of them had ancestors that had already been here for generations. My mother's family came here in the 1600s. We are not immigrants, and America is not a nation of immigrants. And I want you to remember that every time you hear one of these liberal lies, one of these big lies that are so big that people don't even catch it, that we are a nation of immigrants, I want you to remember that the term immigrant and native born are two mutually exclusive terms, and we are most assuredly not a nation of immigrants. The only way the liberals get by with that is by confusing the terms and preventing rational thought by deliberately confusing terminology. One looks forward as we move toward one of their manic goals of a one-world state. Since they believe that someone like me, whose ancestors were here in the 1600s, is an immigrant because we're descended from immigrants, then it will probably, since Cro-Magnon man replaced the Neanderthals, we will hear that we are a world of immigrants. I sort of hate to give them that idea, but I commend it to you that those of you in the room who are young may yet live to hear the liberals explain that we are a world of immigrants. The next lie, which I will counterpose to our truth, is one of their other favorite mantras, and that is, diversity is our strength. As one witty friend of mine remarked, there should be a bumper sticker that says, diversity is our strength. Say it till you believe it. Diversity is not our strength. Diversity is a weakness, and any student of history knows that, and any student of current affairs knows that. Diversity is not a strength in Northern Ireland. I have roots that run back to Northern Ireland. I know many of you have roots that run back to Ireland, and we're all here today because, well, regardless of whatever boat we came over on, we're, as white European Americans, we're all in the same boat now. But the fact is, that anyone who reads his paper knows that in Northern Ireland, where my distant cousins live, in Ballymoney, diversity is a source of unhappiness and conflict and is not a source of strength. Diversity is not a source of strength in Sri Lanka, where the Tamils and the Sri Lankans are busily going at it. Diversity is not a strength in Lebanon, and in Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina, we have examples of why diversity is not a strength. And if this country goes on with the liberal policy of unrestricted immigration and fostering every group except the founding core of this country, then I think if you want to know what multiculturalism and the future of America is, you need only to look to Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, and you will see what the future of America is, and it is not a pretty picture. Much like the German poet Heine remarked in the 19th century, he was unfortunately quite correct. He said that he had very pessimistic views of the 20th century, and he would advise our children to get used to the idea of Russian whips and leather and boots. And that was a very prescient prediction, and it doesn't take a genius or a prophet to look at Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina and know that diversity is no strength. The liberal answer to that would be, of course, that we Americans are different. That we are nice people, and that won't happen here. I do not believe Americans are different. I am an American. I think I am a reasonably patriotic American, but I think Americans are governed by the same laws that govern every other kind of human being on this planet, that we are not God's special little pets. Unlike what Reagan said, we are not the shining biblical city on the hill. Maybe we should be. But we put on our pants one leg at a time in the morning, just like every other two-legged mammal on the planet. And we are not different, and we are not going to overcome and repeal the lessons of history because we are nice people, and they're not nice in Kosovo. Another lie, the idea that multiculturalism, if that is to be our country's future, leads to somehow a grander, greater culture. You don't have to be a great student or to have an Ivy League education or PhDs like our panelists up here, not me, but our other panelists do, to know that great cultures are usually the result of small localities. Those of you who believe in states' rights might think about that and add that to your arsenal. The great cultural moments in our part of the world among European peoples were things like Periclean Athens. Athens was not multicultural. Athens was xenophobic, as was Renaissance Florence and Elizabethan England. All of these great explosions of culture and creativity came in local, small, particularistic, exclusionary countries. Multiculturalism will simply blend all cultures into an undifferentiated brown culture that will leave nothing memorable behind it. So we are fighting to preserve the possibility of a future great culture by opposing multiculturalism. Another lie, opposition to multiculturalism is racist. I don't have time to delve into all of the ramifications of the term racist, which is simply a made-up, fabricated term of abuse that liberals have invented with which to conduct intellectual terrorism and silence debate. But multiculturalism itself is racist. What we are experiencing as white European Americans is the ethnic cleansing of whole areas of our country, which will eventually be extended to every portion of our country. We're not having multiculturalism in Dade County, Florida. We're having ethnic cleansing of Anglo-Americans and their replacement by Hispanics. The settling of a country by aliens of another country, a settling of one set of people amongst another people, is defined even by the United Nations in the Genocide Convention, which I'm not here to endorse, is an act of genocide. It was an act of genocide when President Roosevelt's Uncle Joe Stalin resettled Latvia and Estonia with alien settlers so as to crush the spirit of the Estonian and Latvian people and to destroy their nations. It is genocide when the Chinese communists who are funding our current president are resettling Tibet with non-Tibetans. This is an act of genocide. It is, by their own definition of the term, a racist act. And multiculturalism, as practiced in America, is in fact racist. And we are not, in the terms of their word, racist in opposing that genocide. The next lie is the idea that those who are implementing this policy, these liberals and cosmopolitans and multiculturalists, that these are morally superior people. They are better than you and me. They are laying down a higher law to us, the sort of the Eleanor Roosevelt, Alberta Schweitzer, carrying the morality and civilization to the native white American savages. These are not nice people. And the way we know that they are not nice people is by one certain fact, and that is they will not practice what they preach. Multiculturalism and these liberal programs is intended for little rednecks like you and me. It's not intended for the big guys. It's not intended, the Kennedys do not practice multiculturalism in Palm Beach and Hyannisport. And any of you who are not in this room, but any liberal who may be hearing, any of you who think that Teddy Kennedy lies awake at night worrying about you and poor people are in big trouble. You do not have it in focus. The very people who promote this policy in my hometown of Atlanta are liberals like our ex-mayor Ivan Allen, who sent his children to, at that time, all white and still overwhelmingly white Westminster School, an elite Presbyterian prep school. The integration or race mixing with the blacks, that was promulgated by Ivan Allen, but was to apply only to the children of working class and middle class whites in East Point and Decatur and places, certainly not home in Buckhead or in the rich areas of Atlanta. I once saw George Wallace appear at a Meet the Press, and they were attacking him about racism in Alabama, a state only one state over from my home state of Georgia. And I was impressed as a child watching him when he asked the reporters to please raise their hands as how many of them lived in Washington, D.C. and had their children in the public schools. And none of these litmus tests, oh, so goody-goody liberals, not one had his child in a public school. And George Wallace, and I'm not here with any great brief for him either, but George Wallace said to them that he came from Balfour County, Alabama, and he said, I don't know anybody so bigoted that they've moved out to get away from the black people. That was left for the liberal journalists to do. This elite that governs us lives completely outside the rules that they foist on everybody else. They live in exclusive, almost purely white neighborhoods. They put their children in private, almost all white schools. I wonder if these liberals, I've been trying to figure them out for decades, the extent to which they are simply complete cynical liars, and the extent to which they are simply mentally deficient. You wonder, you know, Robert Burns said that it was the gift of gift to see ourselves as others see us. I wonder if these people, like Hillary Clinton, or Teddy Kennedy, when they're looking at themselves, when Kennedy is shaving in the morning or Hillary is putting on her makeup, do they ever look in the mirror and see them as we, the proles, see them? If they ever see them as we should see them, and that is that they are far worse than their own false stereotype of the French aristocracy before the French Revolution. I think you could read French history and not come up with any French aristocrat who behaved with the contempt toward the people of France that these people behave toward us, and who refuse to play by the rules that they impose on everybody else in the nation. So do not be deceived. Liberals and multiculturalists are not nice people. They are bad people, and we are nice people. The final lie, before I move on to more erudite and inspiring talks, is the lie. This is the view from the peasantry. Those folks like Pat Buchanan was describing in New Hampshire with the pitchforks. The final lie, which is the most devastating of all, is the lie they have foisted on all of us white European Americans, and that is the lie, you've heard it over and over, it's inevitable. We heard that in the South all during the struggle over the mixing of the schools. It's inevitable. We can't do anything. All is lost. And in fact, among people of our persuasion, it's almost among some of them a badge of honor, that you get your rank by having the longest face and the most pessimistic, negative worldview. And I'm guilty of that too. It's hard to be optimistic in today's world. But all is not lost. All is never lost. We come from a race that has done amazing things, that has sent men to the moon, something that's inconceivable for the other races of the world. We have produced people like Shakespeare and Pericles and Michelangelo. We have a wealth of talent in our race, and we live in a country that is still predominantly a white European country. Little Latvia, which was only 50% Latvian, recovered her independence when the evil empire finally dissolved and self-destructed. Surely, if a little country like that, with 1.5 million people, almost half of whom were alien colonizers, like the people they're using now, let's not call them immigrants, let's call them colonizers. If little Latvia could do it, who are we as white Americans, as 70 or 80 million British Americans with 50 or 60 million related cousins, that we cannot do it here is preposterous. And we speak for the overwhelming majority of people. People agree with us. They don't agree with Teddy Kennedy. They don't agree with Hillary. They agree with us. To some extent, the media, which is in their hands, is able to be the mediator and mislead people. But we do represent America, and all is not lost. It is lost if we believe that all is lost. In the Battle of Seven Pines, when Lee and Davis went out to meet General Johnston, who was retreating and giving up, Johnston recited to Davis and Lee a whole litany of reasons of why he could not defeat the Northern troops, the way Lee did only a few days later. And he explained they have more cannons, they have ships, they have more men, they have this, they have that. And Lee replied, General, if we cipher, we lose. That is, if we count heads, we lose. If we are defeated ourselves, we cannot win. And Davis wisely removed him from command and put Lee in command, and the South won the battle in the Peninsular Campaign and preserved her independence for another 3 or 4 years. So all is not lost. Everything stands before us. We have infinite potentialities if we only secure the will to do so and are true to ourselves. So with that, I'll move on to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Samuel Francis. It's trite to say that he needs no introduction. He doesn't for most of us here, but for the purposes of those watching on camera, and for some of you, he does need an introduction, and really all of us need to be reminded a little bit about him. Samuel Francis is a nationally syndicated columnist. He has a newsletter which is available here in the back, and to which I know that he would love for you to subscribe, and which would help him financially if you would subscribe. He is the author of a book called Beautiful Losers, which deals with the inability of the conservative movement to get very far in this country. He's considered the leading strategist on the right in our country, and as many of you know, he was fired from his job with the Washington Times because of his espousal of his views in connection with the survival of our people in this country. And for that, he owes our eternal gratitude and also our financial support. Thank you. Now, turn it over to Sam Francis.
Thank you very much, Sam. I particularly agree with the part about the financial support. Our topic today on this panel is multiculturalism and the future of America. And as Sam Dixon mentioned, we usually think and often think of multiculturalism in the context of immigration, and we heard a lot about immigration from some very good speakers this morning. And it is quite true that what drives multiculturalism in America's schools and politics and culture generally in this country is the immigration phenomenon, that if there were not so many immigrants coming into this country from different cultures, different civilizations, different races, we would not hear very much about multiculturalism as a phenomenon. It wouldn't come up. Why would you have multiculturalist education if you only had one homogeneous culture in this country? But nevertheless, as important as immigration is to multiculturalism, it is not the only basis of multiculturalism, especially given the fact of mass immigration. And we hear a great deal more about multiculturalism from people who are not necessarily immigrants. We talked a little yesterday in the board meeting and the other meetings about the controversy going on in Richmond, Virginia right now about the display of a picture of General Robert E. Lee in Richmond. And I'm told that this coming week there's going to be some rallies and demonstrations in support of that picture. I hope the council members who are in the area will take part in that and support it. But the controversy is really a very good, I think, illustration of what multiculturalism as a phenomenon, as a political and cultural phenomenon, is really about. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the controversy in Richmond, about the Lee picture. I know that some of you probably know a lot more about this controversy than I do, and a lot more about the personalities and the issues involved in it. I know basically what I've read in the Washington Post and some of the other local papers, and if I make mistakes or leave out important facts, I hope you will correct me or inform me later on. But I think that what I am going to say about it is true as far as it goes, and illustrates the points I'm going to make about it. The main point is that I think that many people on both the right and the left in this country misconceive what multiculturalism is really about. Many of us think that multiculturalism is simply a kind of add-on or a kind of extension of Western culture, so that if say people from Latin America want to have some of their holidays and some of their cultural institutions observed in this country, many people in this country think, well, why not? It's an all-inclusive country. We can sort of bring it all together and have that too, you know, just as we have St. Patrick's Day or Polish polkas and that sort of thing. Why can't we have Cinco de Mayo? Why can't we have some of these other non-Western institutions? I think what the Lee controversy shows is that that is a very inadequate conception of what multiculturalism is about. What is going on with multiculturalism and the people who push it is not simply a demand for more diversity or more tolerance. It is really a demand for the destruction of our way of life and our culture and our race, and a demand also for the dominance of their culture and their way of life and their race. It is very much a conflict between over the question of which race and which culture is going to be dominant. There is the famous passage from Lewis Carroll's book Through the Looking Glass, where Alice is talking to the famous egg Humpty Dumpty, and they get into an argument over the meaning of some words, and Humpty Dumpty says, it's not a question of what this means, there's only one question, that is, who is to be master? That is precisely the question that is involved in the multiculturalist controversy in this country. The background of the Lee controversy in Richmond has to do with the display of a picture of Robert E. Lee put up by something called the Richmond Historic Riverfront Foundation in an area known as the Canal Walk. I don't know Richmond well myself, but apparently the Canal Walk is a historic area and it's being restored or developed, and the display of the picture, I believe, was supposed to be temporary while this construction was going on in order to attract new business into this area. And the people who put up the picture in the Canal Walk were the people who ran this foundation, and I don't know, but I'm sure that they are all fairly moderate to conservative, probably Republican businessmen, largely white. And just to show how multicultural and multiracial and tolerant they were, they also put up, along with the picture of General Lee, pictures of Chief Powhatan from Indian history, you know, the father of Pocahontas, who was going to beat John Smith's brains out, and a chap named Gabriel Prosser, who I'm told was a slave revolt leader in Virginia who had plans to burn down the city of Richmond. So this shows how, you know, this is a typical stupid businessman way of thinking, you know. Let's put up a picture of Robert E. Lee and Gabriel Prosser because they're both right, you know. But this is what you get. This is what you get with the kind of people who run the country today in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the business elites. Well, there was a man in Richmond, a member of the city council, a black person named, who calls himself Sayad Al-Amin. This is obviously not his real name, but it makes him feel important to call himself that, so I don't know what his real name is, but anyway, Mr. Sayad Al-Amin saw this picture and demanded that the picture of Lee come down. I don't know that he objected to the picture of Gabriel Prosser or Chief Powhatan, but he did object to the picture of General Lee. He said that Robert E. Lee was like Adolf Hitler, and he had fought for the Confederacy, and that had enslaved his people, and he would not tolerate this picture going up, and as he was quoted in the papers as saying, either it comes down or we jam. And there was some controversy and discussion in Richmond about what exactly the word jam meant. And Mr. Sayad Al-Amin went back and forth on this, and he said, well, it doesn't really mean that you burn the city of Richmond down, as Gabriel Prosser wanted to do, but you just sort of kvetch, you know, and well, I mean, I don't know, but anyway, the businessmen who ran this thing immediately took down the picture. Immediately, there wasn't any controversy about it. But then, when people in Richmond saw what was going on, they got angry about this, many of them, and to its great credit, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, and I think members of the council in the area, and some other people who staged rallies and circulated petitions and protested this. And it's still being discussed, and it may be that the picture will go back up. Councilman Sayad Al-Amin says that he wouldn't object to the picture of Lee going up if you could show Lee kneeling to General Grant at Appomattox. In fact, they're now talking about putting up pictures of other great Virginians to sort of counterbalance General Lee, great Virginians like Abraham Lincoln and General Grant and others. But I think what's interesting is that when you're talking about real multiculturalism is exactly what Sayad Al-Amin is objecting to. Multiculturalism is what the foundation actually did put up on that wall with Powhatan and Prosser and Lee. And it doesn't make any sense. They didn't see that. And actually, to his credit, Al-Amin did see that. It doesn't make any sense to put up a picture of Lee and Gabriel Prosser on the same wall. But the point is that it was the foundation that was actually promoting multiculturalism and multiracialism. What Sayed al-Amin is demanding is not racial harmony, he's demanding racial hegemony. He's demanding that all vestige of white traditional Southern culture go, and that only the triumph of black culture be represented there. And he makes a great point out of pointing out that the population of Richmond today is 55% black, and that Lee and that heritage doesn't represent them. And indeed, the Washington Post recently quoted in a follow-up article about the controversy, they quoted a black architect in Richmond with the unfortunate name Thurmond Alford. I think it's unfortunate that a black man has to go through the life with the name Thurmond. But anyway, Mr. Alford said, General Lee stood for defending Virginia, defending the way of life in Virginia, which was slavery. We have too many things reminding us of General Lee. We have Lee schools, we have Lee bridges, we have Lee statues. So therefore, we have too much of that. Therefore, we should have more of my culture, my race. Now, the thing is that when the SCV, and I would salute the SCV for getting involved in this, because they traditionally have not gotten so much involved in these controversies, but they did on this one, and it was good of them to do that. But when the SCV and others got involved in this, I think they gave a rather misconstrued argument in defense of the Lee picture. What they tended to do was to point out that, well, Robert E. Lee and Hitler are really not comparable figures. Robert E. Lee was, in fact, a kind slave master who freed his slaves and only reluctantly supported the Confederacy, and was a great general who was respected and admired by many people for his military leadership and all of that. The problem is all that is irrelevant to what was going on. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to Councilman Sayed al-Amin whether Robert E. Lee was a good Christian or a kind slave master or a nice man or a good general or whatever he was. To invoke all of those arguments to the multiculturalists is rather like going to Lenin after the Russian Revolution and saying, you know, Tsar Nicholas was really a very nice man. Why don't you build a statue to Tsar Nicholas? The whole point of the revolution was to get rid of the Tsar. The whole point of the multiculturalist revolution is not to have the celebration of many cultures or diversity. The whole point of the multiculturalist revolution is to get rid of our culture and to enthrone someone else's culture. And this is exactly what Mr. al-Amin wants, and what his supporters want, and what the white elites that run the city of Richmond and this foundation are too flaccid and supine and too mentally underdeveloped to understand or to resist. It's interesting also that in another part of Virginia, in Williamsburg, there was an article in the Washington Post the other day, which I'm sure many of you saw. There's a similar sort of multiculturalist controversy going on that's sort of indirectly related to this, and that has to do with a new series of reenactment skits that are taking place in Richmond, in Williamsburg for the tourists. As you know, they have, Williamsburg is famous for sort of bloodless skits where women come out and churn butter, and they shoot off firecrackers and three-cornered hats and that sort of thing, and sort of representative of the way people lived on the eve of the American Revolution in colonial Virginia. But according to the Post, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here briefly to illustrate this, what's the new program. And the Post says, but a gripping program unveiled here a few months ago called Enslaving Virginia weaves the shameful history of human bondage into the fabric of storytelling at Williamsburg, underscoring a revolution fought for the liberty of some, but not all. This edgy new representation of colonial life casts costumed actors as slave leaders and slave owners while paying tourists find themselves in the roles of slaves. The reenactments are so realistic that some audience members have attacked the white actors in the slave patrol, who have had to fight to keep their decorative muskets. And when some early performances drove young children to tears, Williamsburg added debriefing sessions afterwards to help calm them down. Well, all of that is, of course, very similar to, frankly, communist brainwashing, where you're trying to manipulate people's attitudes and basic emotional reactions to events rather than to shape their minds, their rational faculties. But there's an interesting quotation in the story from a black lady named Linda Redmond, who went to Williamsburg, and she's quoted as saying, I used to think, why go to Williamsburg? There's nothing there about us. Well, it's an interesting statement because if you think about it, millions of Americans of all ethnic backgrounds and heritages go to Williamsburg, and even if they're the descendants of, say, Italians or Irish or Poles, East Europeans or Southern Europeans who came here after the generation of the American Revolution, they still identify with what's going on in Williamsburg. They still identify with the colonial experience and with the origins of the American nation that's being displayed there. But it's interesting that this black lady does not, that she draws a very firm distinction in her mind between them, the white people at Williamsburg, and us. There's nothing there about us. And she admits that the displays are now somewhat improved because they are talking more about the history of slavery and all of that. But still, it's mainly the American Revolution and the colonial experience to her are foreign experiences. And that quotation is contrasted with that of a 9-year-old white boy named Jason Murdoch, who told the Post that he chose to make a return visit to Williamsburg over a trip to Disney World, and he wanted to help one of the actors portraying one of the slaves in this skit, he wanted to help the slave escape and to evade the slave patrol so that the slave could go and fight for the British during the American Revolution. So here is this 9-year-old white child who has been taught to deny his own, not only race and culture, but also his own nation, and is actually siding with the British in the American Revolution. And he's quoted as saying, I just think a person's a person. A white person is a person, a black person is a person. It doesn't matter. Well, it's interesting that the black lady is quoted as affirming the reality of race, and the white child is quoted as denying the reality of race. And again, I think that tells you about the whole purpose and the whole hidden agenda of multiculturalism. There's nothing multi about it. It is simply a power struggle to destroy the dominance or hegemony of one culture and one race and substitute for it that of another race. Finally, I will end with a quotation from a man named Leonard Zeskind, who is not a man well known to most of you. Leonard Zeskind is kind of a low-rent Morris Dees, which may be an oxymoron actually, but whereas Morris Dees is fairly well known and a famous man, Leonard Zeskind is a not so well known left-wing witch hunter based in Kansas City, where he runs something called the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. And he was interviewed recently in Dees's magazine Intelligence Report about the the rising tide of white nationalism that is supposedly sweeping the United States and going to take over the country any minute now. It's really a very pessimistic interview because of all the great headway that white nationalists and white supremacists are making all over the country. And he's asked toward the end of the interview, so what is the future Americans face? And Zeskin says, I'm not an alarmist, or I'm trying not to be, but I do think that unless we come forward with an enlarged multiracial internationalism as an alternative, we're heading down the road to a larger conflict. We have to recognize that we live together in this country and that we have a common culture, and this, quote, white thing is a mere invention. The hope is in things like all these white teenagers who wear baggy pants and skateboard and live and work with their black neighbors. We've got to amplify that. Well, it's interesting when you think about that, because we used to be told that the only hope was that inner city teenagers would go to school and go on to college and get professional jobs and sort of move up the social and economic ladder, and in a word, act like whites. Now we are told that the only hope is that whites will act like inner city black kids. What Zeskind is actually advocating here, quite frankly, is the Africanization of American white youth. And that is essentially what multiculturalism means. This is essentially the same agenda that I've been describing in the controversy over the Lee picture and what's going on at Williamsburg. Multiculturalism is not about diversity, it's not about tolerance, it's not about learning to live with people of different cultures and different backgrounds and different races. It's about power. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samuel Francis. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Hart. We don't have time for lengthy introductions, but I did want you to know a little bit about Dr. Hart. He is a professor of astronomy and physics, was at Trinity University and Anne Arundel Community College. His PhD is from Princeton. He is the author of The 100, which is a collection of many biographies of the 100 most significant people in world history, I think. His second book is A View from the Year 2000, I believe, 3,000. I think both of these are available for sale back in the corner, and I invite all of you to purchase them. He is a frequent speaker and supporter of the American Renaissance. He also, I might say, in a lot of things that I could say that are sort of personal and subjective that don't really belong here, but I think Professor Hart has performed an special service by his partition proposal, which is a study of a solution to the problems we have in America. It's a radical proposal and one that would shock people, but I think that it's a path-breaking thing he's done, which I commend to all of us, that we conservatives tend to gather together and moan and groan and try to outshock each other with horror stories of what's happened in different areas of the country. At some point, we have to formulate solutions, and that will be difficult and at first very controversial, but it's hard work, but it's important work. And Dr. Hart has been a path maker and a groundbreaker in that regard. And so I introduce Dr. Michael Hart. Thank you very much.
This panel, we're talking about multiculturalism. Now, my background is largely in academia, and so I'm going to talk more about multiculturalism in academia. It's been pushed very hard in academia for the last few decades. And the word multiculturalism has at least two different meanings, and is used, in fact, in these two different ways for quite different purposes. The first meaning is the rather benign meaning of multiculturalism, the type of multiculturalism that none of us can argue with or dispute. For example, we're Americans, and we read American literature, of course, and we study the American Constitution, American culture and laws, and that's altogether fitting and proper. But our forebears, the ancestors of American culture, came from England, and so it's quite appropriate that we study English ideas on law. Our laws are based on theirs, our legal system is based on theirs. That we study English history, that we study the great English playwrights like Shakespeare, great English novelists, poets, philosophers like John Locke, who so influenced the founding fathers of the United States. And all these people speak to us, and an educated person should know something about English culture, and the more we know about it, you might say the more culture, the more we can gain from this. But it doesn't stop there. We could also study French culture, for example. The great French novelists like Balzac and Stendhal, and philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu, some of whom have greatly influenced the American constitutional system, our ideas of liberty, our ideas of ethics. It's appropriate that we study these and try to get the best we can from French culture. And likewise, we study in universities the works of the Italian Renaissance and later Italian writers and culture as well. We study the artists, the sculptors, the architects. We study political philosophers like Machiavelli. We study writers like Boccaccio, and many others. And Italian culture has very much to offer, and it's good and praiseworthy that we learn about this and gain from it. And in like fashion, we will study Russian writers such as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov, and many of us have read their works and have gained from it and have learned from it. In fact, most of us think that we should not stop there, and we should look at classical Rome and classical Greece. Now, those are very different peoples indeed. We live in an industrial era. They lived in an overwhelmingly agricultural society. And we believe, most of us, in one God, some of us in no gods, but the Greeks and Romans were polytheists, and the idea of monotheism was strange to them. They didn't know very much about geography. They just knew their little corner of the world. The ancient Greeks, anything more than 300-400 miles away, 500 at the most, was terra incognita. They had no idea what was going on there. We have a map of the whole world. We know the world is round. We look at these foreign countries. We can travel all over the place. There are other ways, too, in which their views were very, very different, and their society was very, very different than ours. And yet we look back at these Greek writers and philosophers and poets, and, gee, some of them are marvelous. And we study the works, say, of Sophocles, of Plato, Aristotle, Aeschylus, Sophocles. We study these in school, and we learn from them, and we're impressed by it. This is a valuable addition to our culture. And I'm in favor of all of this. I'm a multiculturalist, if that's what multiculturalism means. How could we be anything else? If we want to take full advantage of our own culture, we should learn from our forebears and from other cultures. And when multiculturalism was first suggested for American universities as an extension of this, it was merely defended. It was defended from the grounds that, well, after all, China is not part of European culture, but nevertheless, they have produced remarkable works. And Chinese architecture is fine, their painting is fine. If China was governed for so many centuries with relative peace and prosperity, maybe we should study the works of Confucius. Maybe we can learn something from that. That doesn't mean replacing our whole system, but perhaps getting some good hints on how we might improve it. And we can look at the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, or the Book of Mencius. We can study Japanese novels or Japanese philosophers. We can study perhaps from Indian philosophy, we can study the Rig Veda and the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Ramayana, or modern Indian writers like Rabindranath Tagore, who are really excellent. Well, I have no objection to this, although we should put primary emphasis on teaching ourselves and our children American culture and European culture. But yes, we can gain by getting the best, by learning the best of these other cultures. That's multiculturalism A, which is used so that the man in the street hearing about multiculturalism has got to be in favor of it. But in practice, that's not what multiculturalism means in academia. It's quite different. Multiculturalism in academia consists mostly of America bashing. It consists of attacks on whites in general, white males in particular, dead white males they particularly hate. Somehow a dead white male is even worse than a living white male. And of course, attacks on capitalism. Overwhelmingly attacks on capitalism. And in general, you might put all this together as an attack on white American culture, or present American culture, if you wish. And so they're not too interested, therefore, in just presenting unvarnished the best offerings of China or India or Japan. One of the multiculturalist students said, hey, forget Confucius. We're not really interested in that. And no, they aren't. Now, what are they interested in? Well, a text which is a favorite of theirs. A favorite used, say, in Stanford when they got rid of the old Western civilization course and replaced it by a new multicultural agenda. A favorite text there is I, Rigoberta Menchú, with a subtitle, An Indian Woman in Guatemala. And the book is a biography. It turns out that significant parts of this biography are fictitious, made up lies, to put it bluntly, but let's just say not completely accurate. However, what is her life like? Well, she details how she is oppressed as a woman, and oppressed because she is not a white, and of course oppressed by the capitalist system. And as this biography winds up, she becomes naturally a feminist, and a rather radical feminist, and a socialist, and a communist, and winds up in Paris, where she's attending Popular Front conferences, discussing on bourgeois youth and talking about Molotov cocktails, and renouncing marriage and motherhood. Now, the book is actually translated and transcribed by a French feminist, Elizabeth Burgos-Debray. And Elizabeth Debray says that Rigoberta speaks for all the Indians of the American continent. Really? Do you really think that most of the South American Indians wind up in Paris in cocktail lounges spouting Marxist doctrine and Marxist vocabulary? No, she is not selected for that at all. She does not represent the best of American Indian culture. They're not interested in the best of American Indian culture or Chinese culture. They're interested in taking examples they can find of Marxists from these different continents and use them presenting their ideas to attack America, the United States, whites in general. Rigoberta Menchú is a mouthpiece for a sophisticated left-wing critique of Western society. When they talk sometimes about people being overrepresented, whites being overrepresented in the curriculum, well, in a sense, that's true. I mean, I can think of one white, his name was Karl Marx, a European philosopher, and boy, is he ever represented in this multicultural curriculum. Now, there's another reason, another aspect of this multiculturalism B, which might be simply said, called dishonesty. You see, they don't really want to study an authentic non-Western curriculum. That would cause problems. A basic difficulty here is that by and large, non-Western cultures have no real tradition of racial equality, nor do they have any tradition of the equality of the sexes. Many of these cultures, in fact, have very deeply ingrained ideas of male superiority, which would shock not merely late 20th century Americans, but 19th century Americans or 18th century Americans. They are so extreme. And therefore, when we're studying multiculturalism, it has to be done dishonestly in this multiculturalism B. To give an idea of the dishonesty involved, Let me give part of the discussion that went on at Stanford. Stanford University, it's about some 15 years ago or so, they replaced their Western civilization course by a multicultural course there. And it was debated rather heatedly on campus whether they should do so. And I don't want to take remarks by some extremist out of context. Rather, I want to take remarks by someone who argued quite eloquently and was taken as a leading spokesman for this multicultural curriculum which was put in. And that was a man named William King, who was president of the Black Student Union at the time and debated openly, and his speech was paid careful attention to. And he complained that under the existing curriculum, he was, I quote here, I was never taught the fact that Socrates, Herodotus, Pythagoras, and Solon studied in Egypt. I was not told that the Greek father of medicine was really Imhotep, a black Egyptian pharaoh. I was not told that algebra came from the Muslim Arabs, or that the woolly-haired Moors in Spain had indoor plumbing and air conditioning. I did not learn that Toussaint Louverture, who defeated Napoleon in Haiti, directly influenced the French Revolution. Now, he made a whole bunch of other statements of this nature, all of which, you notice, are false. They're all false over here. Socrates never went to Egypt, never studied there, nor did Pythagoras or Solon. Imhotep probably had nothing to do with medicine. In any event, he's not a pharaoh, and he wasn't black. Algebra long predates the Arabs. The Greeks had a developed algebra, and for that matter, the Babylonians and Egyptians had elementary algebra before that. The Moors in Spain were not woolly-haired. They did not have indoor plumbing. They didn't know anything about air conditioning. Air conditioning is invented in the 20th century by Carrier. Toussaint Louverture did, in fact, lead a slave revolt in Haiti, and did so quite brilliantly. It took place in 1801 and 1802, 13 years after the French Revolution, so of course it did not influence it. What William King is complaining about is that it did not teach him a pack of lies. And what he wants to install under the guise of multiculturalism is, let's teach a lot of lies. That's what multiculturalism, in practice, multiculturalism B is, although it masquerades and is defended by the virtues of multiculturalism A. That's all I want to say about this. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. Our next speaker, it's a tremendous honor to be here on this panel with all these, but someone who I count as a personal friend and someone who I admire very much, Sam Jared Taylor. Mr. Taylor and I are both sons of Presbyterian ministers. Ironically, we had sort of the same nanny, he in Japan and I in Atlanta, a Presbyterian missionary who left Atlanta and went to Japan. He is unusual in our ranks in that he does not come to us from a conservative background, but from a very liberal background, his father having been a missionary seeking to mix the religions of the world and to Christianize the Japanese, and having himself come out of a liberal family and value system in his college. He's a graduate of Yale University. He is the author of Paved with Good Intentions. He is the founder and editor of American Renaissance, and someone who, if anyone helps change the future of our nation, someday somebody will have to mention Jared Taylor as one of the ones who played a role in that salvation.
Well, thank you very much. We have heard a number of talks now about multiculturalism from a kind of macro point of view, an overall point of view. I'd like to speak about multiculturalism from a micro view, a small incident, and try to discuss how it throws light on the larger picture. And my point will be this, that our insistence on multiculturalism, on multiracialism, on all these multis, slowly puts more and more constraints on our discourse, that it is, in fact, a slowly tightening noose on what we are permitted to say and ultimately what we are permitted to think. This has to do, my perspective on this has to do with a report that the New Century Foundation, which publishes American Renaissance, recently issued. The report was called The Color of Crime. Here is a copy of it, and we released it last month. It has makes a number of interesting points about crime. The subtitle is Race, Crime, and Violence in America, and it is filled with statistics about who is committing crime, under what circumstances, and against whom. Now, I will very briefly summarize some of the more eye-opening findings of this, and I believe it's for sale in this room for those of you who would wish to buy it. And I have shamelessly, in my hucksterish way, put a P.O. box up here for those who are watching on television who might wish to send $5 to this address if they would like a copy of The Color of Crime. Now, summarized in brief, I won't go into this in great detail, but some of the findings were the following: that of the approximately 1.7 million crimes of interracial violence committed every year involving blacks and whites, blacks commit 90% of them and whites only 10%. This means that when we're talking about mugging, for example, a black person is approximately 100 times more likely to mug a white person than the other way around. That's a good, simple number. If you remember one thing, you might remember that. 100 times more likely than the other way around. Another aspect of this that is quite interesting is that when it comes to hate crimes, although whites in fact commit a larger number of hate crimes, blacks are in fact twice as likely to commit hate crimes. And then only one more finding from this report, and then I will move into this question of how this report can throw some light on multiculturalism, and that is, in terms of violent crime, blacks are as much more dangerous than whites as men are more dangerous than women. When you think about this, this is really a rather astonishing thing. All of us have a kind of intuitive sense that men are more likely to commit violent crime than women, and we adjust our behavior accordingly. Well, from a statistical point of view, blacks are as much more likely to commit such crimes than whites as men are than women, and we are just as justified in adjusting our behavior accordingly. This, of course, this finding, of course, is relevant in the current controversy of racial profiling, in which the police direct their law enforcement efforts in part on the basis of the race of a potential offender. And it is a great disappointment to me that when police departments are confronted with this question of profiling, instead of saying, well, yes, of course we engage in racial profiling, and here's why. Instead, they say, oh, no, we don't do that. We never do that. Well, they would be fools not to do it. I believe every police department does do it, and I think they should do it. Now, of course, profiling, whether it's racial or whether it's on the basis of sex, because men are more dangerous than women, on the basis of age, because young men commit more crimes than old people, on the basis of whether or not the guy ran away when the cop car pulled up, that's a kind of profiling too. This sort of profiling is a police tool that can be used properly or improperly. But to say the police must ignore race is as unproductive and, I believe, as hypocritical as to insist that the police must ignore sex. Now, what does this report have to do with multiculturalism or multiracialism? Well, last month when we released the report, we tried to get as much attention for this as possible. And we had a press conference to which all of the media were invited, and in our announcements of the press conference, we solicited a great deal of interest and excitement. Even before the report was released, we had inquiries from Time Magazine, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, Night Reader News Service, NBC Nightly News, National Public Radio. These people wanted to see this report so bad that they couldn't even wait for it to come out. They wanted to see faxed, embargoed copies, even before we had our press release. So, despite the fact that in addition to all of these places, we distributed it to every major news operation in the country, we cannot pretend that these groups were not aware of this report. They were aware of the report. What did they do with it? They ignored it. Not a word about it. Now, I suspect that if the findings had been the reverse, that if the findings were that whites are 100 times more likely to mug blacks than the other way around, that might have been considered newsworthy. Now, If we ask the question, why was it that the media, after showing an initial considerable interest in this report, then chose to write nothing about it, I don't really want to speculate about motive. I don't think that that's often a productive thing to do. It's always a huge temptation, but I will try not to speculate about motive. However, we do have a different case that happened to turn up at almost exactly the same time, in which I think a certain amount of light is thrown on the motives that may have been in operation here. In 1998, just last year, an organization in Duluth, Minnesota, called Violence Free Duluth, decided to conduct a study. They were going to look at every single gun-related violent crime in a period of 1 year and try to analyze these crimes. They were going to look at the relation between the perpetrator and the victim. They were going to look at the race, the age, the sex, etc., the education of the perpetrators, whether this happened at home or out on the street. They were going to study every aspect of the gun violence problem and see if they could find out what was happening in the city of Duluth. Well, in April of this year, just a few months before we released our report, they released theirs. There was a piece of data that they decided not to include, and that was race of perpetrator. After conducting this extensive study, this was the one that they decided not to make public. Now, there were some newspaper reporters who were a little curious about it. Well, gee, what's going on here? Well, Frank Jewell, who was the head of the organization that conducted the report, he said, well, we didn't include it because we thought it might be misinterpreted. Well, let me paraphrase rather cruelly. What is Mr. Jewell saying? Mr. Jewell is saying, you people out there in Duluth, you are stupid. You can't stand the truth. You're not grown up. You can't handle these facts. Mr. Jewell is saying, I'm different. I'm superior. I know how to interpret these facts, but you don't. I can and you can't, so I know this, but we're not going to tell you. Not very nice. Deputy Police Chief of Duluth, Robert Gritdahl, his remarks were almost even more illuminating. He said, if it turns out that, in fact, minorities are the ones who are committing these crimes, quote, it's a comfortable place for white people to park the gun crime problem. It would be a huge distraction, and we wanted to focus on firearms. Well, let me paraphrase again. Is he not saying that if the results of this study show that a vast majority of this gun violence, perhaps every single incident of gun violence, turns out to have been the work of Hispanics or blacks, if that's the case, might it be possible, dare I say it, someone in Duluth might decide, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't have a gun problem, maybe we have a minority problem. This, of course, is the question that multiculturalism makes impossible. We are not allowed to ask that question because in multiculturalism, we cannot have a minority problem. That is forbidden. And so, if we have a study that suggests that might be the case, what do? We simply suppress the data. You might ask yourself, why'd they even bother with the study? The deputy police chief says, we want to focus on guns. So, the whole idea of a scientific study is we test a hypothesis. If our hypothesis does not match up with the data, the scientific approach is to come up with another hypothesis. No, we'll suppress the data instead. Let me draw you a parallel. Imagine that we are at the beginning of the automobile age, and we haven't yet figured out that there should be certain licensing requirements for those that we put behind the wheel. And lo and behold, there's an awful lot of accidents, an awful lot of deaths, an awful lot of injury. And so we put a study together. We have an automobile problem here. Things are really going wrong. And what does our study find? Our study finds that an overwhelming majority of these accidents are caused by drivers who are younger than age 18. Wow. Does that mean that if we If we forbid any driver younger than age 18 to drive, that'll reduce the fatalities by 95%? Well, maybe it will. Well, wouldn't that be a distraction? Our point is automobile violence, automobile danger. So we'll suppress those facts because we have decided that the problem is automobiles. That is exactly what Duluth has decided to do. Now, I said that I was not inclined to speculate about the motives of Time Magazine, AP, the Washington Post, etc. Let me indulge in a certain amount of speculation. Just like Mr. Jewell in Duluth and the deputy police chief, weren't they in effect saying Americans are not mature enough for these facts? Weren't they saying that we know better? Weren't they saying that something might go wrong? These people, unlike us, these rubes out there, you tell them the truth, no telling what'll happen next. So we simply will not report this news. There's another interesting incident that I can describe. I believe it was the July 7th New York Times. They had a front page story on this vexing problem of the persistent gap in test scores between blacks and whites. A long story filled with one attempted explanation after another that the authors of the story themselves conceded were unsatisfactory. This gap persists. Why is it that whites from poor families do better than blacks from rich families? Why? In paragraph 3 or 4, the writer concludes, no one knows. No one knows. Well, Arthur Jensen knew 30 years ago. And today, Charles Murray certainly knows. Linda Gottfredson of the University of Delaware knows. Michael Levin of City College knows. Sandra Scarr, emeritus of the University of Virginia, knows. Phil Rushton of the University of Western Ontario knows. I know. Everyone in this room knows. Everyone in this room knows, and I suspect that even the editors of the New York Times know. But there it is, in black and white, on the front page of our most prestigious newspaper. Nobody knows. Breathtaking, isn't it? Well, this is the kind of conclusion that I believe the dogma of multiculturalism and of egalitarianism forces upon us. We must go to these extremes. We must suppress data. We must pretend not to know, because these are the implications. The implications of this knowledge violate today's dogma, and that we cannot stand. Well, let me ask you, how many times have we told over and over and over again, our form of government requires an informed populace? When the sovereign people exercise their sovereignty, aren't they supposed to do it on the basis of knowledge? Isn't knowledge better than ignorance? But in effect, isn't Mr. Jewell saying the sovereign people will be kept ignorant? Because an ignorant populace is more likely to think as we would wish them to think. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this represents a crisis, a serious crisis, when the people who govern what we are told and what we are taught to think are in effect saying, we know better. We can handle this information because we are superior, but those people out there, they cannot. We will hide this information. Now, I'm happy to announce to you, we have an ally in our cause, an important ally, an ally I'm proud to introduce to you. Former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. This is what she wrote recently. The U.S. is moving toward a system in which the government presides over a number of different social groups, some of which have their own language and type of education. This approach undermines social unity and allows construction of a multicultural society, which is the very opposite of America's previous practice. She goes on to say, the government aims to supervise these different groups and keep the peace by redistributing income from one to another. Thus, the utopia of multiculturalism involves a bureaucratic class presiding over a nation divided into a variety of ethnic nationalities. That, of course, looks awfully like the Soviet Union. Such a system cannot work, and its failure is likely to inflict great damage on the people, their traditions, and their liberties. Thank you, Lady Thatcher. Thank you. I would point out, though, that in some ways, our system is even more insidious than the Soviet system. In the Soviet system, you had political commissars you could point to and say, well, this guy made me do it. We had a censor. He made me do it. Well, who can Frank Jewell point to? Who can the Duluth deputy police chief Grotdahl point to? No, they're their own censors. We have an even more insidious system than the Soviets did because it's within us all. Every one of us is his own political commissar. Our system is more insidious still. And I think that Margaret Thatcher is beginning to see what is going on in America because she fears for her own country. Now, in conclusion, I would like to quote from the great British poet, Rudyard Kipling, from whom Lady Thatcher may have taken some inspiration. The poem is called The Stranger. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you, but I'd like to read it anyway. The stranger within my gate, he may be true or kind, but he does not talk my talk. I cannot tell his mind. I see the face and the eyes and mouth, but not the soul behind. The stranger within my gates, he may be evil or good, but I cannot tell what powers control, what reasons sway his mood, nor when the gods of his far-off land shall repossess his blood. The men of my own stock, bitter bad they may be, but at least they hear the things I hear and see the things I see. This was my father's belief, and this is also mine. Let the corn be all of one sheaf, and the grapes be all one vine, ere our children's teeth are set on edge by bitter bread and wine. Thank you very much.
We have promised to end on time, so we have only time for about 7 minutes of questions. For that reason, others, I'd ask people to keep their questions brief, and I know we often like to preface them with a little statement, but if you make that very brief, what we'll try to do, if I'll ask Dr. Francis to remind me, is I'll try to repeat the question while the person it's directed to comes to the microphone for the sake of the videotapes. Questions? Mr. Foreman.
Who are the beneficiaries of multiculturalism? I can see educators because we have to keep students in school even longer enough to absorb a basic education. You've already managed to drag out an 8th grade education to 16th grade. I can see the educators in favor of dragging it out for 24 years. But who else benefits?
Well, I don't know to whom that's directed. The question is, who has benefited by multiculturalism? I would say the people who are winning, who are taking the colonizers, the colonists, the settlers who are taking the land for us are benefited, and the extreme plutocratic rich who acquire cheap labor are benefited. They are benefited. And thanks, Mr. Broadwell.
It seems like
to whom is your question directed?
I don't know, just whoever wants to answer it, I guess. It would seem that the total fraud that the whole civil rights movement is now being come to light, and the fact that supposedly civil rights was to address the wrongs committed to slaves in our history, but now it extends to all immigrants who move here, or anyone. If you're a non-white immigrant, as I understand, you're still eligible for affirmative action for all these benefits. So it seems to be that this is a worldwide redress of grievances, maybe from white Europeans to everybody else who's not white. And how does this not just show that we have to fight this battle we've lost it increasingly, and it's the same battle keeps coming to the fore, which is this redress of wrong of the whole world now. It's not just supposedly former slaves who are need to be redressed. Now it's the whole world that we have to give into and give up what we have to these people. I don't know if that's a question, or I didn't mean to make a statement.
Hard to rephrase. I think I would phrase it as a question, maybe direct to Dr. Francis, of why is it that the scope of all of the social engineering has now been broadened from the alleged victims of segregation and slavery to include people who just stepped off the boat? Why do you think that is, Dr. Francis? The microphone.
Well, I've noticed the same thing. I've noticed this during the presidential election in 1996 when I made the Herculean effort to watch the vice presidential debates between Jack Kemp and Al Gore. And they talked about affirmative action. I will not go so far as to say they debated affirmative action, but they did talk about it. And I noticed that Gore's defense of affirmative action did not invoke past wrongs to black people or non-whites. He didn't mention that. What he mentioned was diversity. We have to have more affirmative action because we have to have more minorities in prominent positions, more jobs, more college admissions, more promotions, and that sort of thing, also more women. Again, I think well, I mean, the rationale for affirmative action has obviously changed. They don't emphasize righting past wrongs or sort of handicapping the people who have these privileges in the competition like they used to. Now it's just, quite frankly, almost a blatant statement that we want more non-whites in elite positions. And it's also very directly implied that unless we have government help and government management of that through affirmative action, they're not going to be in those positions. And I suppose they would say, well, that's because of racism and prejudice and all that. But I think that the main argument now has become just almost explicitly a blatant appeal to power, or we want more non-whites in what has been a white society. So I think it's perfectly consistent with my argument that multiculturalism is basically just a power trip.
Yes, in the back.
I'd like to thank all of you panel members for being magnificently impartial in your political incorrectness. But do any of you think that the future, with the advent of homeschooling, private schooling, is there a chance that we may quell this tidal wave of lies and distortions at any time in the future?
I'll answer that. The question is, is there any way that we can stem this tide, given the lies and distortions that people are being taught through education? Yes, I think there is. It was something I intended to mention in my speech, and that is a statement by Aristotle, which I read not long ago, which really struck me, which is that truth is immediately apparent to the human mind and eye and ear, whereas a lie has to be worked. And I think that is true. The truth is immediately compelling and is immediately apparent, just like it is immediately apparent that we are not a nation of immigrants, and that we have the truth on our side, which is no small weapon, even given the fact that they have the big guns. Did you want, yes?
I think that the country, in effect, is moving simultaneously in two different directions. On the one hand, we have the people that I was describing earlier, these folks in Duluth, the people who generally tell us what to think, the people who mold the institutions in this country, all going in one direction, and yet there is a kind of surge in the opposite direction. This report that I mentioned to you, I failed to mention that the Washington Times ran a very substantial piece on it. The Washington Times, in fact, interviewed two very prominent criminologists about the numbers in this report. Morgan Reynolds at the Criminal Justice Center in Dallas and James Q. Wilson of UCLA. They confirmed, yes, these numbers are true, but we just don't dare talk about them. Now, this information we sent out to many, many radio stations, and as a result, I've been on perhaps 40 talk radio programs. This information can be gotten out. It will be on the internet. It will be it'll be sold many thousands of copies. I think that while in the ethereal realms of those who can insulate themselves, as the Kennedys and others do, there is this tendency to go on with a certain amount of disingenuousness about what really matters in this country. More and more people are breaking through because of a kind of alternative media, things like American Renaissance, which I publish, many other publications, because the actions of the Council of Conservative Citizens. So I'm very optimistic that despite the blackout in some areas, that the truth is getting through.
I think we will. I'm sorry, but we have to end at this point. I would like to introduce Rebecca Sutherland. I've been asked to have her stand, who is running for the South Carolina House of Representatives. Any of you from South Carolina are commended to her. Thank you, Ms. Sutherland, for willing to get out on the firing line and take the abuse and fight the fight. All right, we'll now take a 15-minute break. I guess. Dr. Hart. They want our magnificent
Photographs. Oh.